Okay, good morning, everyone. This is a public meeting to consider the proposed comprehensive official plan and zoning bylaw amendments listed as items 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, and 9 on today's agenda. For the items just mentioned, only those who make oral submissions today or written submissions before the amendments are adopted may appeal the matter to the local planning appeal tribunal. In addition, the applicant may appeal the matter to the local planning appeal tribunal if council does not adopt an amendment within 150 days of receipt of the application for zoning and 210 days for an official plan amendment. And a comment sheet is available at the door for anyone wishing to submit written comments on these amendments. So, are there any declarations of interest? None? Confirmation of minutes from the meeting of April 10th? Are those carried? Okay. The first item is site plan approval, 195 Meandering Brook Drive. I know that Councillor Jeans would like to speak to this, but we also have a speaker on that, so we'll hold that. Item number 2 is the official plan amendment, 4305, 4345, and 4375 McKenna Casey Drive, and 3285, 3288, 3300, 3305, and 3330 Forest O'Kane Road, and that's in my ward in Barrhaven. And we have Frank Cairo. Frank, you're here. And Patrick Harrington. Does anyone have any questions for either Frank? So are you prepared not to speak if we're prepared to carry it? Yes, Frank? Okay, thank you. Is this item carried? Thank you. Item number 3 is the zoning bylaw amendment for 373 Princeton Avenue, and this is in 527 Melbourne. This is in Councillor Leeper's Kitchissippi ward, and he just, and Carl, you're here. Where are you, Carl? So if none of us have any questions, you're prepared, you don't care whether you speak? You're just here for questions, representing the applicant. So, but thank you very much. And Councillor Leeper just wants to make a couple of comments.
Very briefly, Chair. I just want to say thanks to particularly Uniform and the development team. This is a significant number of new homes in Westboro. This is the private market component of the partnership between Cornerstone Housing and Uniform to develop the Jeanne d'Arc Institute. So as a result of this partnership, we're going to have, I think it's 32, 36 units of affordable housing for women in the old Jeanne d'Arc Institute building. The remainder of their property is going to be developed by Uniform with the rezoning that hopefully will pass today. And my thanks go to the developer. While this is a partnership, I assume that there is some contribution being made by the developer. It's at a level of intensification that is sensitive. They didn't grasp. This is a reasonable number of units. The community has not pushed back. So it's a win-win-win for the community, for Uniform, and for Cornerstone, whose fundraising campaign is continuing ongoing right now to help get that affordable housing built. So I do hope colleagues will support this. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Leeper. Is this item carried? Carried. Thank you. Item number 4 is zoning bylaw amendment for 740 Springland. Pardon? Okay, it's being held by Councillor Brockington, and we do have Lloyd Phillips and Rod Leahy are here as well for questions. Okay, so that was being held. The next item is the application to alter 132 Lisgar Road, a property located in Rockcliffe Park Heritage Conservation District, designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act. We don't have anyone to speak to this. Does anyone have any questions about this item? Is it carried? Thank you. Item number 6 is zoning bylaw amendment for 473 Albert Street. Councillor Catherine McKenney is here. It's in her ward. We also have Jeff Nadeau from FOTAN. Does anyone have any questions for Jeff? Are you here? And so, Jeff, if we're prepared to carry this item, do you still need to speak to it? Okay, great. Is this item carried? Carried. Thank you. And number 7 is the, and I should tell you that simultaneous interpretation service is available for this item and number 8 as well. Application to permit the demolition of the Ugandan High Commission, 231 Coburg Street, a property located in Wilbrod Laurier Heritage Conservation District. An application for new construction on the same site. We'll be holding that because we have speakers, as do we for the zoning bylaw amendment number 8 for 231 Coburg Street, so that will be held as well. And just so that you know, at the beginning when we get to that item, I'm going to ask the chair of the Built Heritage Subcommittee, Councillor Toby Nussbaum, to give us a little bit of an analogy to prepare us for our contemplation today. Okay? Number 9 is the City of Ottawa Zoning Bylaw 2008-250 Omnibus Amendments, Q2 2018. Does anyone have any questions on these? Is the item carried? Thank you. And then the last item is the status update, Planning Committee inquiries and motions for the period ending 9th of April 2018. Anyone have anything on this that they want to talk about, or is it received? Is it received? I think we only need to receive it, right? Yeah. Okay, so going back to the beginning, which is the deferred item, which is the site plan approval for 195 Meandering Brook Drive. And Mr. Diaco, you're coming forward. Thank you. Anyone else that would like to leave? Get out now while the getting's good. Okay, so as you know, at the last, two planning committees ago, Meandering Brook Drive was brought forward as a, and with some concern addressed by Councillor Deans. And so planning committee asked staff, the developer, and Councillor Deans to go away and have a conversation about what could be done. So as you know, we do have a motion that Vice Chair Tierney has. But before he introduces that, I thought that Councillor Deans, you might like to have something to say, or would you like to wait till after?
I'd like to wait. Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to have the motion introduced first, and then Sharon Haig. Sharon, are you here? And Sharon wants to speak. And Danny Page is here from Vailcraft.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Whereas the Planning Committee at its meeting on April 10, 2018 deferred the consideration of the site plan approval for 195 Meandering Brook Drive, whereas the motion of the deferred city staff were directed to explore any and all options in finding a solution to the traffic and transit problems, whereas the city staff have considered the options and have met with the developer to determine what solutions are possible, whereas the developer has agreed to the options below. Therefore, be resolved that Planning Committee approved that delegated authority for the approval of the site plan be returned to the manager, Development Review South, and such approval would be including the following conditions. 1, the owner shall be required to construct a bus pad on the south side of Leicester and Meandering Brook, together with the median at this intersection, estimated cost of $12,000. 2, the owner, in addition to the other securities required for the site plan, shall provide the securities through a letter of credit to the amount of $33,000. 3, should the city proceed with the construction of the pedestrian crossover at Leicester Road and Meandering Brook prior to the deadlines in the recommendations for below, the owner will contribute $33,000 towards the cost of the pedestrian crossover. 4, the city shall have until 2 years after the 90% occupancy of the units on site plan to proceed with the construction of the pedestrian crossover. Should the construction have not proceeded by this time, the $33,000 security shall be returned to the owner. 5, that the total contribution of the owner to the bus pad, median, and the pedestrian crossover shall be capped at the lesser of $45,000 and 50% of the total $12,000 plus the cost of the pedestrian crossover.
Thank you. Sharon, would you like to come forward, please? You have 5 minutes to speak. This is Sharon Haig. Have you been here before? Because you turned that button on quite quickly.
I've not been here before, but I've been at many meetings where these microphones are required.
Well, as I said, welcome. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'm Sharon Haig from 105 Meandering Brook Drive. I've been a resident on that road for almost 11 years. So I come today with the issue of safety and visibility for our exit. So we were promised over 8 years ago that traffic lights would be installed at that intersection, and so we've been waiting for those lights to go in. And we just find that the speed on Leicester is 80 kilometers. And sometimes it's very difficult to pull out of Leicester onto Meandering Brook, both east and west, as there's conflict with the cars as you come out. If you're beside somebody going left and you're going right, they pull out, you pull out. It's difficult. Also, when you're entering Deerfield Village, heading west on Leicester, and when we put our right turn signals to turn into the property, people, trucks, cars, and are all passing us, and it's 80 kilometers. So I just even find it dangerous when you feel somebody come up behind you. So I feel with the installation of these concrete barriers in the middle could in fact be more harmful to the area than not. I'm also asking or just whether there's a ability to put a sign for the hidden entrance, because I find at night or in snowstorms that Leicester, Meandering Brook, as we come onto Leicester, is very hard to see in a snowstorm or even in the dark. There's one light there now. So we were, again, waiting for the traffic lights to come in to solve that issue there, but there's limited lighting in that area. I think that's all I had to say.
Well, you've raised some good points. So I'm going to go over to Colin Simpson. And Colin, maybe you could speak to when the work on the investigation of Leicester is going to happen, but also confirmation that a hidden intersection could be added as signage, or any other comments you have on what Mrs. Haig said.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So we'll review the signage again, and part of the plan includes the installation of pedestrian warning signs, 35 meters on the approach on either ends of the intersection, so that will help with the visibility of the awareness of potential pedestrians crossing the intersection. We'll have staff do another site inspection to see if there's any overgrown trees that could be in the way that's limiting the sight lines that could be cut back to improve the sight lines. There's already an existing street light at this intersection, and we're reviewing the illumination of the lights and likely an upgrade to a Cobra lens, or a Cobra lighting will likely be involved in the upgrade. Those are the main things that we're looking at. And just to remind committee again that this segment of Leicester is due for a widening within the next 7 or 8 years. So the road will be widened to 4 lanes. So there'll be better opportunities to make those movements with a de-acceleration lane to make the right movement. But it is a double yellow line on the approach, and there will be the hazard markers that's part of the center median installation. So vehicles will no longer be able to pass. Right-turning vehicles, they'll need to slow and slow down, and they won't be able to pass right-turning vehicles entering into Meandering Brook.
Thank you. Councillor Brockington has a question of Mrs. Haig. Ms. Haig or Mrs. Haig? And Councillor Deans has a question of staff? Okay. So, Councillor Brockington?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for coming down this morning. I appreciate it, and I'm not sure if you were here at our last meeting. Your local councillor did a very good job informing this committee about the historical challenges at this intersection, and we certainly had a good discussion. I wanted to get your feedback on what's being proposed now. The Vice Chair of this committee read out some modifications that are being proposed at that intersection. It's not a light, but a median a potential crosswalk, a bus pad. What's your reaction to that, at least?
Well, yes, we're obviously, I was not here at the last meeting. I apologize for that. We were very much looking forward to the lights being installed to have solved all of these issues. So we seem like we've gone back a little bit. I mean, something is better than nothing to reduce the speed on Lester. I live up the block, and I can still hear the cars racing down the road. So anything we can do to reduce the speed would be great. The bus stop is excellent, and the safety issue of the bus stop there and a pedestrian crossing would be advantageous.
Thank you, Sharon. Thanks for coming out today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Councillor Deans, questions for staff?
Yeah, just a follow-up to one thing that Sharon Haig raised, and that was the safety of those concrete medians. Can you just assure the committee that you don't think that they would actually create any safety issue?
We don't expect this center median to have a safety issue. I mean, there will be hazard markers on both ends of the median, and there's a large gored area out already acting as a painted median. So, what we're doing here is just reinforcing the fact that there is a center median area, and we're building in some pedestrian refuge as a safety outlet for people trying to, cross the street in a safe manner to get to the transit stop. So. It conforms to all tax standards, and it's similar to other treatments that we have elsewhere in the city.
Can I speak?
Pardon?
Can I speak now?
No, because I have Danny Page.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Danny, do you want to come forward? You don't have to. Does anyone have any questions? Danny's representing Vailcraft. Sure. Anyone? I don't see any questions, and I want to thank you for your cooperation over the past month. And your willingness to support this motion and the finances associated with it. Thank you very much. Councillor Deans, is there anyone else before we give wrap up to Councillor Deans? Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Chair Harder, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues, Councillor Blais and Councillor Eglai, who were very helpful, the Chair of Transit and Transportation, in coming to a resolution. And I also wanted to thank the representatives from Vailcraft for their cooperation, and city staff for their work on this file, and the Planning Committee. I know you aren't always seized with site plan, but this is an important issue for this community, and I thank you for taking the time to come to a resolution. So effectively, there were two issues that we raised the last time. One was reasonable access for an entire community to public transit, and the other one was a concern about the access and egress. So what we have come forward with really, I think, addresses fairly well the issue of access to public transit, and I think that's a really important consideration. Because the speed's so high on Lester Road, we can't put a PXO in because the speed's 80. But the city staff have said that they do think that there is potential, because of that center concrete median, of the speed actually reducing, in which case we could then install a PXO. And so what we've done is taken a security. Vailcraft have agreed to pay for 50% of a PXO. So I'm hopeful that we'll end up with a crosswalk there, a good crosswalk, a PXO, and access to transit. Because the traffic control signal wasn't warranted at that intersection, there's really no way to compel Vailcraft to pay for that. So this is, I think, all we could reasonably get, but I think it's much better than it was the last time we were here. So I did really want to genuinely thank everyone for participating. I think we've served this community much better. So thank you.
And thanks for coming out and educating us on part of your ward. Thanks very much. So on Meandering Way, is it carried? Carried. Thank you. So the next item that's held is 740 Springland Drive, and it's held by Councillor Brockington. And we do have, is this for questions? Because I do have Lloyd Phillips and Rod Lahey here. I know that they represent the applicant, but what's going to fit best with what you want to do? Okay, so I think we'll have them come up first. Do you want to do a presentation, or are you here for questions? I'm talking to Mr. Phillips and Rod Leahy. They're coming up, so I guess that's my answer.
We are prepared to do a presentation if the committee's wish, otherwise we have no need to do one.
Do you want, okay, we don't need a presentation. Thank you, so we've got you registered as coming out. And so I think we have comments, I think that Councillor Brockington wants to make.
Yes, Madam Chair. I do thank, first of all, the committee for the opportunity to speak and provide some history and context to this item and help the committee understand what are some of the issues in the neighborhood that may not be germane specifically to the motion before us, but certainly are secondary issues that need to be addressed. So the property is in the Moonies Bay neighborhood of River Ward. What's interesting about this particular neighborhood is it's seeing 4 different development files at the same time. Council dealt with Canoe Bay last month. We approved the Youth Services Bureau new building on Riverside. We have the Norbury Apartments expansion, and there's another file that will be coming shortly on Brookfield Road. The current development of the Norbury Residences is a 4-apartment building complex. There are 3 apartments that are 6 stories in height, and there's 1 building that's 10 stories in height. So we already have a high-density apartment complex in this neighborhood. And what the owners would like to do is expand within their complex by building 3 more apartment buildings, not as tall, 4.5 stories, but nonetheless still add or expand the number of units within the complex. And that question is not being put towards the committee today. They're not seeking a zoning amendment for the expansion because the land is already zoned for that purpose. What's before us today is because the new buildings automatically trigger a requirement for parking, there is a request to not provide the expected parking for both tenant and visitors because there is such a significant surplus of parking already from those 4 apartment buildings. There's good transit in the community. There's a number of people, tenants who don't own vehicles, and so upon reflection, the owners who are about to commence with their expansion plans have reflected and would prefer to use surplus parking spaces than be forced to pave over green space and tear down trees. And on that argument, that makes sense. Why force people to pave over green space and take trees down when they can use parking that already exists? The third part that's before us, Madam Chair, is to provide parking on the inner circle laneways of the existing buildings. So the 4 buildings that exist now have semicircle driveways, and they're going to use some of the green space on that property to take out, to provide more visitor parking. We've successfully got the number down. It used to be 40. It's now down to 26, and there's still some wiggle room when we get to the site plan. But why I held this, Madam Chair, is I do wanted to just address and get on the record some of the issues that I've heard that some of the both tenants and nearby neighbors have raised with me. The intent of the Norbury residents to expand on the site has existed for many, many years. This has been in the public domain under my tenure for a number of years as well. There have been 2 well-attended public meetings, and certainly people have been engaged. And again, not necessarily germane to what's before us, but I just have some liberties to raise this to get it on the record. Because these buildings have had a 50-plus year history in the community, certainly existing tenants have raised issues with me about some of the repair and state of the buildings, which I've raised with the owners. There's a parking garage now that is attached to the largest building. That's going to come down in the expansion process and be rebuilt. There's a lot of concerns that some of the tenants who are either older or have mobility challenges who are going to be served in the interim. Again, that will be worked out through the site plan and post-approval. And of course, OC Transpo, as this facility expands and hundreds of more residents come, our buses, which are challenged to serve the community at peak times already, will be further challenged. So when this comes to council, I'm going to ask some questions to OC Transpo and get their answers on the record. But Madam Chair, I mean, the issue for me is, do I want to, out of spite, hold this up because people are concerned about the expansion, which is not a question that's before this committee, or look at the positives of using parking or surplus parking that already exists. And so I'm not here to speak in favor or against the expansion plans, rather to at least publicly acknowledge that there are concerns that exist in the community. But if their expansion plans proceed and they can use parking spots that are surplus already, that for me, from a planning perspective, is the best way to go. So I just wanted to highlight some of those issues, get those on the record. Again, the issue of whether they expand or not is not before the committee, rather the question about whether we approve their parking variances, and I just wanted to provide those comments.
Okay, thank you, Councillor, and I just would ask our committee coordinator, what's your official title? That's it? Ms. Stephanie, that if you would please advise OC Transpo that Councillor Brockington's going to be asking some questions, so that Mr. Manconi will need somebody, probably a Pat Scrimger or somebody like that. Okay? Just so, you know, we have the right people at the table since we have advance notice. Okay, so on the item, is it carried? Carried. Thanks very much. So we're going on next to, and I'm going to ask people that are speaking to speak to both the application to permit the demolition of the Ugandan High Commission 231 Coburg Street, a property located in the Wilbrod Laurier Heritage Conservation District, an application for new construction on the same site, as well as item 8, which is a zoning bylaw amendment for 231 Coburg Street. And to set the stage for this, as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, I've asked the Built Heritage Subcommittee Chair, Councillor Nussbaum, to set the stage, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, so this item first came to Built Heritage Subcommittee at its February 8th meeting. As colleagues may know, this is a building in the Wilbrod Laurier Heritage Conservation District, and is a Category 3 building, which in that HCD is a contributing building. It initially had a score of 44, but in doing research on this property, members of the community established that it was the home of Lester B. Pearson during the period of time that he was Minister of External Affairs. So as a result of that, the Heritage staff acknowledged the score for the building would have gone up from 44 to 49. Still as a Category 3 building, still a contributing building, but in this case, staff were recommending demolition because of the state of the building and approval of an application for new construction. For those who don't know the building, it's a mid-century two-story apartment building. And so when this came at February 8th, there was considerable discussion and public delegations at the meeting. I would say that there was a general concern at the committee in February that there had not been an independent assessment of the structure of the building. Some concerns about, given the fact that the Ugandan government had owned the building since 1985, was this a case of a property owner not taking precautionary steps to ensure the proper repair and state of the building? Those were some of the issues that came up in February. As a result, the committee directed staff, it was a deferral, or a referral, I guess, and the committee asked staff to undertake an independent engineering study. And the goal was, the committee had hoped that at least portions of the building could be retained, reflecting its cultural heritage value. Staff came back to Built Heritage on April 12th, having done an independent engineering study, and there was further discussion at the April 12th meeting. The independent engineering study, concluded that, in this case, John Cook and Associates concluded that they felt that demolition was justified given the state of the building, but also acknowledged that there was a way to preserve it with sufficient investment in the property. And the issue is the foundation slab had degraded. There were cracks in it over time. And I'm sure you'll hear from members of the public views on that. So at the end of the day, the committee was faced with this independent engineering study. and voted once again on this. The committee was split. It voted 5-2 in favor of rejecting the application for demolition. And I think it's fair to say that for the majority of members, the concern was really about rewarding what they felt was a case of a property owner not taking sufficient care of a property and rewarding demolition by neglect. And two members, including myself, voted in favor of the staff recommendation, most not because we disagreed with the concerns around the message that these sorts of demolitions send, but at the end of the day, the motion that we asked staff to look at in February was followed. The revised application did reflect a couple of the changes that had been requested in the Cultural Heritage Impact Statement. So there were two or three small changes made between the February and the April version. And since on its face the motion had been respected, that was the view of the minority. So that gives you a bit of a summary of the case. I'm sure through public delegations you'll hear differing views on the question as to whether this is a salvageable building and what the responsibility of the owner ought to have been. So I'll leave it there.
Well, that's good. Thank you very much. I think that was important that you had that opportunity. And so we have a lot of people in front of us, and led by, on the heritage side, by Court Curry, who's the manager of Right-of-Way Heritage and Urban Design Services, and then Doug James, who's the manager on the planning side. So if you could introduce the people up here, I think that would be helpful for people in the audience, and certainly in case anyone around the table doesn't know who they are, and for the delegations.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To my right is Sally Coots, our Senior Heritage Planner. Besides her is Simon Diaco, who is the planner on the zoning bylaw file before you. Doug James, Manager of Development Review for the Central Area, and Dana Collins, Program Manager, Heritage Urban Design on my team.
Perfect. So we're going to go to delegations because we do have a few. And first up, so I don't know how you're going to manage that, but yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay, so Chad Rollins is here. He's the president of Action Sandy Hill, and we did receive comments from you as well, Chad. I'm going to ask you, you signed up for both 7 and 8. I'm going to ask you to speak to both of them together. And this is not your first rodeo. You've been here before.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. My name is Chad Rollins. I'm president of the Community Association Action Sandy Hill. I do have some slides. I'm hoping you're able to see them. I'm just here to respond further to our written submission, which I hope you all received. And we're asking today that you please refuse the application to demolish the building and the rezoning of the site. Before you here, you'll see a photo that's actually Lester B. Pearson and his wife Marion, taken in 1957 in the living room of their home at 231 Coburg Street. This was their residence in the late 1950s, the golden age of Canadian foreign policy. Often referred to as Pearsonian diplomacy, this period included the founding of the UN and NATO, presidency of the UN General Assembly in 1952, and the leading of the UN intervention in the Suez Crisis. The timeline here is important. Pearson and his wife bought this house in 1954. In 1956, the Suez Crisis erupted, and Pearson led the UN intervention, creating peacekeeping. This earned him the Nobel Prize in 1957 and influenced strongly his view that Canada needed its own new flag. In 1958, he became leader of the opposition and moved from this house to Stornoway. When he became Prime Minister in 1963, he pushed for a new Canadian flag, which was eventually adopted in 1965. Here's a photo of Pearson and his wife when he received his Nobel Prize. And I don't think his importance in the world at that time can be overstated. Upon being awarded the Nobel Prize, the presenter said of Pearson, "He was the man who contributed more than anyone else to save the world at that time." Here we see a few examples of foreign missions in Sandy Hill. Traditionally, it's been seen as beneficial to have these foreign missions occupy our historic buildings. They have the resources to maintain them. There's some fine examples shown here, including the Australian High Commissioner's residence, the Angolan and Croatian embassies, and in the background, Stadacona Hall, which was home to Sir John A. Macdonald at one time and is now the High Commission of Brunei. Sadly, though, the Ugandan High Commission and other examples are now arising where our heritage resources are at risk due to the neglect of foreign governments. We're very concerned that allowing this demolition will set a precedent for other situations with foreign missions. This is a clear situation of demolition by neglect. The independent expert hired by the city stated in their report, and I quote, that the building stood vacant for 4 years and unheated through at least 2 winters, and that this worsened the situation. Even the proponents' own experts state in their planning rationale that the building's condition is due in part to deferred or inadequate maintenance over the past few decades. Indeed, the Ugandan High Commission has owned the building for more than 30 years. Just yesterday, we found a 2015 annual report prepared by the Auditor General of Uganda, which states on pages 438 through 441 that since 2012, various consultants have undertaken reviews and inspections of this property. In 2013, a consultant recommended remedial work be undertaken within 1 year and warned that there would be consequences if that was not done. The government of Uganda budgeted roughly $1 million US for that work. But the AG found on inspection in 2015 that the work had not yet been completed, and they concluded that, and I quote, "The delay in renovations has caused further deterioration as earlier predicted by the consultants. After 2 years without renovations, the property is now recommended for demolition." I don't think you can get clearer evidence of demolition by neglect than that. The Built Heritage Subcommittee, as Councillor Nussbaum mentioned, had passed a motion in February asking that, at least in part, the applicant be encouraged to prepare a revised application that retains or incorporates a significant portion of the existing building. Sadly, this was not done. We know that the Ugandan AG's report says that $1 million was budgeted previously for this work, and that has not been spent. Rather, they spent $350,000, according to the AG report, on consultants to plan for the demolition and replacement of the building. Wouldn't that money have been better spent on preserving this piece of Canadian heritage? So just in conclusion, this is a building of significant cultural heritage value. It is a contributing building in an HCD. It is contributory to the Prime Minister's Row initiative, and it's clearly a victim of demolition by neglect. And yet, despite all that, the experts say it's still possible to retain it. So perhaps someone other than the Ugandans would be willing to do that. We would encourage you, therefore, to uphold the Built Heritage Subcommittee's recommendation and refuse the application for demolition. And we would also encourage you to refuse the application to rezone the property to commercial, as this sets a precedent that's unappealing for the neighborhood. All of our other embassies and high commissions are zoned residential with diplomatic mission as a permitted use. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad. Anyone have any questions for Chad? Thank you for coming out.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Francois Breha. Francois, welcome.
Good morning, Madam Chair. My name is François Brega. I'm a resident of Sandy Hill. I'm here today to represent Prime Minister's Row. Prime Minister's Row is a citizens' initiative to preserve the prime ministerial legacy in Sandy Hill. We oppose the demolition of 231 Coburg Street, and we're concerned by the design plans that have been advanced to replace this important building. 231 Coburg Street is part of a unique cultural landscape in Sandy Hill that exists nowhere else in this country. Indeed, over the past 150 years, the neighborhood has housed an extraordinary number of nationally important people, including 7 Fathers of Confederation and 10 Prime Ministers. Many of their homes and houses of worship remain standing, making Sandy Hill one of the most important heritage neighborhoods in the country. This heritage includes Lester B. Pearson's former residence at 231 Cobourg. The period in which Pearson lived at 231 Cobourg represents the pinnacle of Canada's golden age of diplomacy. As Chad Rollins noted, it was while living at 231 Cobourg that Pearson led the United Nations intervention in the Suez Crisis, which led to his award of the Nobel Peace Prize. In recent decades, the demolition of some of Sandy Hill's nationally significant built heritage and the corresponding denigration of the surrounding public realm space has become more acute. This has resulted in a loss of awareness regarding the historical importance of the neighborhood, leaving it vulnerable to decay. Prime Minister's Row grew out of a desire to halt this downward cycle and to preserve and protect Sandy Hill for future generations and to celebrate the nation-building efforts of our Prime Ministers. The proposed demolition of 231 Cobourg Street runs counter to these efforts. It would destroy one of the key buildings we're seeking to protect. It would undermine the contextual integrity of the cultural landscape, and it would deprive Canadians from across the country of the chance to connect with their national identity. Our built heritage tells the story of who we are as a people. When we lose it, we lose a piece of ourselves. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, sir. Question, Councillor Fleury.
Merci, Monsieur Brega. A few questions just to maybe...
Just a reminder, Councillor, because I don't know if you were here at the beginning, we do have simultaneous translation available on these 2 items.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm curious, I know that the work of Prime Minister's Row has reviewed holistically a lot of elements, and I just wanted to put to public record, do you recall offhand how many foreign missions we have in Sandy Hill?
There's about 40 or so. I mean, yes, about 40.
And how would you describe generally the relationship within the city and the community of the missions? Generally?
Well, in general, it's been quite positive, and there have been consultations undertaken by some of those missions with the community association in advance of any work done on the properties. And in general, it's been believed that foreign delegations represent a good use of that heritage property because they often have the resources to maintain those properties. We're seeing now, unfortunately, one example here and perhaps a second example on Blackburn Avenue of foreign delegations no longer maintaining these properties, and we're, of course, very concerned by that.
And finally, the effort of, just again for committee and for the public record, Prime Minister's Row has done a series of reviews. How many Prime Ministers have lived in Sandy Hill?
There's 10 Prime Ministers who have lived part of their lives in Sandy Hill.
And that reflects how many properties?
That would reflect more than 10 because some of them lived at more than one property. But with the exception of the house of Sir Robert Borden, they all have houses that they lived in that are still standing in Sandy Hill.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Brockington has a question for you as well.
Thank you, sir, for your presentation. Both you and the previous gentleman have made some strong cases for this committee to consider this morning. I was in Stockholm, Sweden, 3 years ago at the Nobel Museum, and I learned more about Lester B. Pearson there than any other building or place in Canada. Certainly learned through history about the former Prime Minister, but the museum had a very good display on his contributions. Can you just elaborate for me what is in the public good to retain this building, a building that the public aren't going into. They don't get that same sense of the picture that was shown from the previous speaker. It's basically a building on a tour where you can elaborate what happened in this building, why that building is significant. Could the same value not be derived with a brand new building built by the High Commission with some sort of monument or plaque erected on site that gives a description of what happened on the site through the past decades?
Well, I lead tours for Heritage Ottawa of Sandy Hill, and one of the stops is in front of this property. And you're right that a plaque or another monument of some kind could recall that Mr. Pearson lived in that building. But of course, it's not the same thing. And as I mentioned in my remarks, what makes Sandy Hill unique is the assemblage of historic houses where so many of our leaders have lived. And I've emphasized prime ministers and fathers of Confederation, but there were also prominent writers, senior civil servants, businessmen, and others. And it's this assemblage that is important. And yes, we can tear the building down and put a plaque. It, to me, does not have the same evocative feeling that looking at the building itself, showing a photo of Pearson in his living room has as a plaque.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thanks for coming out today.
Thank you.
David Jeans is our next speaker. David's president of Heritage Ottawa. And thanks for sending in your comments as well, David.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and I apologize that you probably only received those written comments this morning. Heritage Ottawa is continuing to hold the position that we presented at Built Heritage Subcommittee on the two prior occasions, 7th of February and 12th of April, supporting the subcommittee's recommendation to refuse the application to demolish this building. And we are suggesting that the owner prepare a design which incorporates at least the shell or significant elements of the existing building in developing a new chancery. We're not commenting on agenda item 8. The zoning is not a heritage matter from our point of view. At this point, we're primarily concerned with the observations and recommendations of the building condition report. You've already been told by Action Sandy Hill that the report, in fact, on page 1, does identify that the building, that work to stabilize the building is structurally feasible, obviously at some cost. We're not experts on the cost or the method that would have to be used to save the building. But whether the current condition of this building is the result of demolition by neglect, as has been suggested, or whether it's a problem with flawed construction from the beginning, those deficiencies should have been identified and attended to years ago. We heard yesterday afternoon about the Uganda Auditor General's report, which Mr. Rollins has described to you, which does state that it was identified 5 years ago that if repair work was not undertaken within a year, that the costs to do so later would increase significantly. And those repairs did refer to the foundation in respect of trees which were causing dewatering and should have been removed. And that Auditor General's report stated that 2 years later, that work had not been done, even though there were funds. And in fact, since that time, 3 years ago, the assumption has been that the building would be demolished and replaced by a new structure. Heritage Ottawa wants to point out that where a building is in a heritage conservation district, as you know, the permission to demolish doesn't exist until there has been public consultation and review by the Built Heritage Subcommittee and this committee. And so the fact that an assumption had been made 3 years ago that the building would be demolished is not a valid reason for having neglected the maintenance. We do request that the government of Uganda demonstrate its respect for Canada's heritage. This is a building that, as you have heard, is of significant importance to the community, and I'm not going to repeat those arguments which have been presented. So we are again suggesting that the Planning Committee should respect the recommendation from Built Heritage Subcommittee and refuse the application. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Jeans. I'm looking around the table. Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Jeans, the staff report scores this building as a 44, which is at the low end of Category 3 buildings. Mm-hmm. Are you in agreement with that score?
Well, that's a technical score, and we don't pretend to be sufficiently expert to determine what the score of a building should be. The case was made before Built Heritage Subcommittee and has been made here by the community that this is a building whose heritage is significant not only to the local community but the wider community. You've heard from Mr. Rollins that it has significance and Mr. Brega that it has significance Canada-wide. There are reasons why the score is not higher. One reason is that it's stated that, Mr. Pearson, as Minister of External Affairs, didn't entertain or do work specifically related to his achievements in the international arena in this building, and that's certainly a matter of debate. In many cases, where a person lived is considered to be a sufficient reason for designating the building. There is a home in Kingston which is designated because Sir John A. Macdonald lived there for a very short time while he was unknown and did not achieve anything, but it's considered to be a significant heritage property.
So if I could just follow up, Mr. Chair, is what happened in the building a more critical piece to your argument than the building shell itself?
First of all, the interior of heritage buildings is usually not designated, so that in fact, normally permission to alter the interior, or even to completely gut it, would not be a matter under the Ontario Heritage Act, certainly for this particular building. But the shell is covered by the Part 5 designation under the Ontario Heritage Act, and so from a heritage point of view, that's the part which could be protected. The interior, the owner is at complete liberty to do what they want with it.
Great. Looking around the table. Great. Councillor Nussbaum.
Just a point of clarification on Councillor Brockington's question. So the initial consultant score was 44, and then what staff are suggesting that had the consultants known about the Pearson connection, the score would have gone up to something in the range of 50.
Question for delegation? Councillor.
This is a contributing building in a heritage conservation district. Do you feel its importance is enough that hypothetically it would actually be designated on its own under the Act? I can't remember Part 4 designation.
I don't think anyone has really spoken in strong favor of the architectural merit of this particular building. It's a bit out of a fish out of water in terms of not being of the Victorian era like many of the buildings that we see in Sandy Hill. But in fact, it's been made clear that the buildings throughout Sandy Hill are actually products of many eras, and so I think from an architectural point of view, you wouldn't designate it. It's really a question of the historical association with Pearson, and specifically that the association of buildings with prime ministers is one of the defining characteristics of that particular heritage conservation district. So it's really brought in under the umbrella of the attributes of the district, rather than being worthy in its own right for consideration for designation.
Okay, thanks.
Great, and seeing no further questions, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Jeans. Our next delegation is Chris Vopney. Chris, if I can get you to come forward. All right, Chris, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm Chris Vopney from John Cook & Associates, structural engineers in town. We were retained to review the existing reports and to provide a visual inspection of the structure at 231 Coburg Street. The documents provided for review included the building investigation reports from both 2013 and 2017, geotechnical reports from both these times, and the 2017 proposed redevelopment plan from 10-4 Architects. Also, the Cultural Heritage Impact Statement prepared in 2017 by Robertson Martin Architects. I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight the construction of the building and the considerable effort that would be required to retain all or part of it. The building is a 2-story composite masonry and wood frame structure on concrete foundations. The foundations are cast-in-place concrete at the perimeter of the building with non-load-bearing concrete block masonry walls at the interior. The masonry is unlikely to be reinforced, and the concrete may contain reinforcing, but is very likely minimal. The perimeter concrete foundations appear to be settling somewhat uniformly, suggested by the pattern of cracking. The northwest corner of the foundation wall has been previously repaired. This intervention included replacing of the concrete with reinforced concrete block and removal of a large tree within close proximity of the foundation wall. Based on our observation, the repair was unsuccessful, and there appears to be a continued settlement since the repair was noted to have separation at the interface between the concrete and the concrete block. In the basement, the interior masonry block walls show signs of major settlement with large cracking through the joints and through the units themselves, and there is evidence that several past repair campaigns have been undertaken, and in all cases the repairs have failed and cracked. This is another sign of continued settlement. The slab on grade in the basement also shows signs of this settlement with large cracking primarily along the perimeter. The perimeter of the building is expected to be the area of most concern with respect to settlement due to the significant weight of the building materials, which are especially heavy compared to the wood-framed houses of the neighborhood. The exterior masonry appears to be multi-width composite brick and concrete block. The exterior brick veneer is connected to a load-bearing concrete block backup with brick header ties at about every 7th course. This construction is not uncommon for this area but has inherent issues. The differences in material properties between the brick and the concrete block leads to differential reactions from thermal expansion and contraction, and this very often leads to snapping of the brick ties which offer the lateral connection of the veneer to the structural backup wall. As more disconnection occurs, the veneer becomes laterally unstable. To retain the brick veneer, this must be further investigated with destructive testing and addressed if found to be an issue. The brick also exhibits significant cracking, most notably at the corners. Again, several repair campaigns were undertaken, and again, continued settlement has led to the failure of past repairs. With continued opening of the cracks, moisture is more likely to penetrate the core of the wall and affect the lateral connection of the two masonry materials. This is again something that must be further assessed with destructive investigation. The ground and second floors are significantly sloped due to the settling walls. The sloping is substantial and is very obvious while walking through the building. Where reviewed, the condition of the joist is generally good, though some environmental damage may be expected. The slope of the floor is too extensive for lifting to be considered, and it is likely that the most efficient solution involves a series of shimming and leveling toppings. This would require structural assessment of the capacity of the joist for their ability to support this additional weight. It is expected that the assessment will lead to localized joist reinforcement. In order to retain a substantial portion of the existing building, the majority of the work will be required at the foundation level, and based on past geotechnical reports, this is best carried out with the use of piles. In order to implement this, the footings and foundation will require considerable intervention. Even if found to be reinforced, the existing foundation will be unable to withstand redistributed loading without reinforcing. The most efficient solution is likely full replacement. This means full support of the ground floor joists and the interior and exterior walls. On this site, the temporary support will prove to be complicated and thus costly, rather due to the proximity of the sidewalk and the neighboring house. Structurally speaking, there's no explicit line defining whether a structure can or can't be saved. Certainly, heroic measures can be taken, but this must be weighed with its cultural value, which is obviously being very well discussed today. Based on the significant effort required to stabilize the structure, we concur with past reports, including the Cultural Heritage Impact Statement, which support demolition. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Fleury, anyone else have questions?
Thank you.
And then Councillor Shirelli.
So I just want to go back. The site's been vacant for how long? Do you recall?
We were told 4 years by the maintenance.
Okay. And do you know if the vacancy is in relation to city building code, or?
I'm not aware.
Okay. The work that you conducted was, did it look at any of the potential retention of sections of the building or the building itself?
It was mostly to assess the building to be retained as a whole. We considered the building as a whole.
And in the report, for those who weren't at Built Heritage Committee, I don't know if I'm paraphrasing properly, but you did say that everything could be retained, but that there is obviously a cost element relating to that. Would that be a fair?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Shirelli?
So my question is about the common sense of this, of trying to retain it. Do you have any cost estimate of what that would be? Because the way you describe it, it sounds like renovating the Titanic while it's at the bottom of the ocean.
We didn't do a specific cost estimate. We reviewed past cost estimates in the report and felt that the estimates that have been previously provided were rather low, and the cost would be higher than previously anticipated. So I don't have a number that we've spent time establishing.
Even that was a bit...
Pardon?
Even that was a bit extreme. Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Robert Martin. Mr. Mulalu, did you want to come up with Robert, or are you just here for questions? You don't need to. It's just...
My point really would be to certainly reinforce what Mr. Walton has said, in a photographic kind of format, unknown photograph.
Okay. So how about this? If anybody has questions specifically for you, I'll ask you to come up. Okay? Thank you. Mr. Martin, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of Planning Committee, for this opportunity to speak this morning. As was mentioned, we were retained to undertake a cultural heritage impact statement for the proposed redevelopment consistent with city policy. The building history has been talked about. Mr. Jeans likened this to a fish out of water. We would totally agree with that. It's important to note that this building itself demolished an earlier building, the original Victorian building that stood on the site. So, this, I guess, speaks to the process or cycle of neighborhood renewal over time. It is, if you like, an American federal style that is quite out of keeping with the prevailing character of the district. I also want to emphasize that, we and the city and indeed anyone analyzing or assessing heritage character, we're operating within a framework. So heritage character may be defined under the actual architectural style itself, so famous architects, actual construction quality, and of course this connotational connection with famous persons. I also want to emphasize too that Pearson didn't live in the whole building. This was a semi. He lived in one half of it. So the actual score of 44 out of 100, which even if one gave full marks, 10 out of 10 for Pearson's connection, would move it to about 49 out of 100. So it's important to understand that within this heritage scoring framework, we're still dealing with an extremely marginal building. This is not a high-grade heritage asset. I want to also emphasize too the building's condition. So both in terms of what the reports we read and our physical reviews on site, this building is literally self-destructing. It is torquing and twisting and deflecting and cracking all over the place. It is not limited to one particular area. I will also emphasize the environmental considerations of mold, asbestos throughout, lead, and one of the things that we found most, I would say, egregious at the Built Heritage Committee was this characterization of demolition by neglect. We are aware of the city initiative, the Mayor's task force on demolition by neglect, but there is abundant and clear evidence of repeated good faith attempts at repair by this occupant over many years. We also would like to note that Action Sandy Hill themselves, on their first walkthrough, was prepared to consider demolition, and that is contained in their letter to Mayor Watson and Mr. Nussbaum as chair of the Built Heritage Committee. And so Action Sandy Hill themselves recognized the absolute dire state of this building. Regarding Prime Minister's Row, I'd like to acknowledge all the great research and effort of Prime Minister's Row. This is a worthy initiative, and nothing that we are doing precludes any of that history continuing to be told. As people have pointed out, there is no physical entry to these buildings at Prime Minister's Road. It's something that's from the exterior, and nothing we're doing precludes that continued story being told. The owner is prepared to have a plaque indicating Pearson's involvement on the site for a few years. And we would also note that the actual formal Lester B. Pearson House is just around the corner at 243 Augusta. So Pearson, in terms of this district, he already has a presence, and he already will be commemorated and can be with the addition of a plaque. So, when we made our assessment with these repeated studies and peer review that all confirm the same finding, it's a sort of a holistic view that in view of the poor heritage character, in view of the dire structural condition, in view of all these other issues, that in balance, the best decision is for demolition. And I want to stress that this is not an easy one for us. We're conservation architects. Our typical stance would be one of preservation, but this is certainly what I would call extenuating circumstances. And with respect to what is technically possible, it's easy for people to say one should do this or one should do that. But the question is, should one do this for a marginal building? And at a certain point, common sense and reasonableness must govern our discussions. So we're coming at this with a sense of practicality that what may have happened may have happened. The Ugandan High Commission, in best efforts, made their attempts to repair or stabilize the building over time, and they just simply aren't working. And at this point, we have to take new measures. And I would also point out that the amount of money that Mr. Rollins talked about from the Auditor General was specifically allocated to two things. One was tree removal, and one was repair of mechanical, electrical systems. It wasn't about actual stabilization of the building. That same Auditor General report in the next paragraph actually talks about the new building being the plan. So there has never been any intention on Uganda's part to, in this Auditor General report, to consider that the interim monies were sort of in place of the building replacement. So overall, members of committee, we would like to summarize by saying that the characterization of this property as demolition by neglect is neither fair nor accurate, and at a certain point, the common sense efforts to allow an occupant to function on their land is what should govern our decision. Thank you.
Mr. Martin, are you the third person of your repute to do an analysis of this location now? Sorry. So in your role, in your capacity that you were hired to review this address, are they the third person? Second? Outside of here, but...
So there were a series of three engineers who had made analyses of the building and the geotechnical and structural issues. And our role, as is required whenever one is intervening in a designated property or conservation district, is to provide a cultural heritage impact statement. So we reviewed those previous structural studies and assessed the building character and its sort of provenance and history and made our deliberations on that basis.
And was it at the direction of the Built Heritage Subcommittee that you were hired to do that?
No, it's just part of
Process?
it's part of city process for any undertaking in a district.
Okay. So in your mind, I think I'm trying to read between the lines of what you said. So you repeat again what you said about the money was slated for two other things as opposed to.
So this excerpt from the Auditor General of Uganda, it does identify monies for interim stabilization, but again, I want to stress that actually there are two bullets under that. One was about tree removal, another one was about...
Can you say that again? Because it sounds like you're saying tree removal.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
That's right.
Oh, my ears are actually working. That's actually... I thought it was some kind of like...
There is... or there was and there is a suspicion that some of the subsidence in the soils around the building and under the building might be connected to depletion of moisture in the soils as a result of trees. And so that some of that interim money was intended to remove trees. And it also talks about systems. So it was not intended to go into any sort of heroic masonry stabilization process. It was more to buy them a little more time until they could follow through on the rest of the building replacement.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have any questions? Councillor Nussbaum, then Councillor Fleury, then Councillor Hughley.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Robert, for your intervention. I'm a little bit puzzled by your characterization of the Auditor General's report, though. This only came to light yesterday, and I'm trying to marry your assertion of repeated good faith efforts of repair with the conclusion of the Auditor General that the delay in renovation caused further deterioration as earlier predicted by the consultants. So we had a consultant report in 2013. We had money released, $1.1 million. Surely the Ugandan government didn't intend $1.1 million to be spent on holding the building up until they could demolish it. I can't imagine that that's what public funds would be used for. So surely the $1.1 million that was released was intended to help stabilize the building in order to maintain the building.
This information from the Auditor General's report was only brought to my attention last night as well, so I'm reviewing it. But from conversations with Madame Ambassador, I understand, first of all, it's not 1.1 million US, it's 1 million Canadian. So even though the document says US, the amount that when it's actually from Ugandan shillings is about $1 million Canadian. And that amount is intended to address the items below. So it relates to tree work and other subsystems. I guess I'm trying to convey that, for better or for worse, through a whole series of studies, investigations, consultants retained by Uganda, they both assessed the underlying conditions, the serious degradation of the building, and quite reasonably may have said any money thrown at the building is a losing cause right now.
So, as you know, and you know where I voted on the outcome, so I'm not disagreeing necessarily on the outcome, but I do think this file raises important and perhaps troubling questions about responsibilities of owners of heritage properties. And since I know you're a heritage, both a professional and an advocate, I'm curious what you think about the fact that this is an owner that's owned the building for over 30 years, 33 years, and you made a statement suggesting that given in your mind the marginal heritage value of the building, perhaps there was never, if I understood correctly, perhaps there was never there should never have been investment in the property with the interest of retaining it. I'm not sure if I understood that correctly, but I guess the question is, are you concerned with an outcome in this case that suggests that a heritage property owner, as long as the building isn't actually vacant, the property standards bylaw staff would have a very difficult case of knowing whether a property was deteriorating or not. But are you concerned that the message that council would send if it agreed with the staff recommendation is, as a long-time owner, you don't actually have to keep your heritage property in a state of good repair, because if it gets to a stage where it has to be demolished, council's going to let you do it.
No, you pose a difficult question, and
Can you make it specific to this location so we don't get on some other tangent?
So, I think one of the
and if you're not prepared to answer,
okay. Well, one of the principles of conservation practice is every case is unique. Okay, so I don't think one should take whatever happens at 231 Coburg to apply to a general understanding of other properties. In this particular case, both the engineering consultants, city staff, ourselves have made the assessment on this particular property, and the conditions have in effect informed our regrettable decision that in balance of all the factors, that demolition is the best way forward. I don't think we're sending any message otherwise. And the point about whether Uganda intended to or did repair over the years, there's abundant and clear evidence that they did expend money, time, effort, attempting to repair foundations, throughout the building, the plaster work. It's all there in full view. So, the track record is demonstrated, and at a certain point, maybe some of the consulting people would advise enough is enough.
Councillor Fleury, followed by Councillor Hubley.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Could you maybe speak to, so the property was owned for 33 years. In the last years or so, the property was vacated. Can you speak to that? Because my understanding is that it wasn't the case where there's an engineer report saying, hey, or even the city's building code team saying, you have to vacate, this property will collapse on you, or something urgent. It was a choice that the High Commission made. Maybe you could briefly speak to that issue?
First of all, there's no any property owner can unilaterally make a decision to vacate a building if they feel unsafe. So if your walls are cracking around you and you can't repair them and it continues to deteriorate, there's a basic health and safety concern that would inform your decisions on your own and your staff's behalf. So I think when one analyzes the general gist of the various studies that started even before 2014, they all are alerting their owners to this ongoing deterioration for which repairs have not been successful. They predict that this condition will continue, and it does, and it has, and it still is today. So for the accumulation of effects, Uganda made the decision to vacate, which again I can't second guess them on that.
And then, do you feel that further to the High Commission leaving that property, at some point a decision was made to remove the heating components? I believe the source of heating was through water, and that was capped at some point in time. Which, could you maybe speak to that as someone that tries to protect heritage? Wouldn't we be in a different position today if the property was properly heated during those years?
My understanding, firstly, is that the heat was not turned off, it was lowered, which anyone would do. Even when someone goes on vacation, you can turn your heat down your building. But as a result of that lowered heat within the building, my understanding is there was a radiator that burst in one area of the building and has contributed to the some of the plaster deterioration that we see. But to your question, would the result have been the same? No. The issues that we see are not related to heat, quite frankly. They're related to underlying geotechnical and structural issues for which heat is not the primary driver.
Okay. And finally, Mr. Chair, the residents in Sandy Hill are, as you know, there's sand, there's Lady Clay, there's so on. I've worked closely with many residents and foreign missions who have had to pin their properties. We've seen collapses of foundation, major cracks in properties, some of the similar attributes that you're giving to this site. Why is this different? Why are you saying that, as a city, we should ask that resident
pin their building and spend that money to pin their building, but in this case, well, it's too far gone. I don't understand. I don't understand the disconnect. There's a disconnect in my mind as to why this is different, understanding that we are in an area of the city that the soils are challenging. And yes, the trees have an impact, and other physical elements have had issues on the buildings, as you're well aware.
So the each location is different. So what might be present in one area of Sandy Hill could be completely different in another. There are places where there is a lot of sand, as the name suggests, and there are other places where clay and other materials are present. So that's one point, that whatever may happen on another part of Sandy Hill doesn't necessarily govern what happens on our site. And the other primary point here is building owners have a choice. It's their own volition whether they choose to invest in their properties. And for one owner, their determination might be that I have a high-grade, beautiful 1924 Victorian, and I want to invest in it perhaps more than the building value. And another building owner may say, no, it's not worth undertaking these heroic measures and significant sums of money to salvage what amounts to a marginal building. I think everyone is in agreement that this is not a high-grade heritage asset, and the connection to Pearson doesn't trump everything else. It doesn't suddenly endow this building with some magic extra grade.
Thank you.
Councillor Hubley?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just would like to ask, you referenced the heritage score sheet and you said 49. 50 is an important threshold, and I know the chair of Build Heritage said he thought it should be in the 50s. Is your 49 something that you're aware of, that staff support as well, and the other, what was there, 3 experts brought in to review this? Like, should this score sheet, basically what I'm going to ask you is, should this score sheet be redone? Is something coming out here in the last week that somehow changes the score around, that it should go up so much?
No, I don't think so. On the so-called heritage inventory that the city has, all of these buildings are scored under the various categories. And again, I want to emphasize, we're not operating in a vacuum here. We actually have a framework for determining whether a building is a high-grade building or a medium or a low-grade, and using the mechanisms that are within the city heritage registry. This one is very borderline. It's it's on the low end, and to say otherwise, it's just not the way. It's not the way heritage is scored, and as we've emphasized, even if one were to boost the score based on the Pearson connection to a maximum 10 out of 10, we'd still be at 49 out of 100.
But if it made it into the 50s, then it's a whole other discussion, right? If we're into the 50s, then it's a building we want to save?
At the low end of the 50s, it would still be a Category 3 building. So, it doesn't really change the outcome.
Okay. So, hang on a second, okay? Yep. Councillor Hubley, just hold that.
I just had to be helpful, Councillor Hubley, to explain. The Will-Broad-Laurier Heritage Conservation District is a bit unique from some of the other ones. A Category 3 building, which is a score between 40 and 55, is considered a contributing building. So unlike the case of Rockcliffe that we dealt with a couple years ago or last year, 50 was an important threshold. In this case, 50 isn't an important threshold. So 40 to 55 is Category 3. It's considered contributing, but it is true that it's at the lower end of the contributing building. So it's a little bit different from some of the others we've dealt with.
Thank you for that clarification. So everything we're hearing then, it still stays at the lower level rating.
Well, it's not a Category 4 or 5. It's a Category 3. It's a contributing building, which is different from a non-contributing building. But I'm trying to be even-handed here. It's a contributing building, but a score can go all the way up to 100. So yes, in terms of the contributing buildings, it's at the lower band of that.
Okay. The other thing that's come up over and over today, and I know the councillor for the area has been promoting that or circulating information about the demolition by neglect. But You seem to take a different position on that and don't believe that that's the case here. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else have any questions for Mr. Martin? Thank you. Thanks very much for coming out today. So we don't have any more speakers? No, he doesn't want to. No, we have no. You don't want to come up, Mr. Mulalu? You figure it's covered? Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're back here. Questions of staff for sure. We have enough of them up here. I'm sure they can cover everything. And if they don't, Dana can come back up. Okay. Councillor Hughley, did you want to go first?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to follow up on that.
Questions, anybody?
To staff. We took the unusual step of having this reviewed 3 times. Is that correct? Three different consultants, if you will, have all reviewed this property?
The Ugandan High Commission undertook two studies, and then at the request of Built Heritage Subcommittee, in February, a 3rd study was undertaken by John Cook and Associates.
Okay, and they basically all came up with the same finding that the building wasn't worth saving. Is that correct? Or the cost would be too high to save, whatever way you want to state that?
It was a little subtler than that, Councillor, but indeed they all agreed that the damage to the building was caused as a result of differentials settling due to desiccation of soils, and also that and the Cook report also pointed out that the building, and as Mr. Faulkner pointed out today too, is the building is extremely heavy because of its construction method, and so that also contributed to the cracking on unstable soil. So the conclusions were the same, the costs varied, but there were, again, significant costs associated with all 3 analyses.
In my experience of 8 years now on planning, whenever there's a heritage property that has even a little germ of worth protecting, you folks are very, very big on defending that property. So when I saw your recommendation in this report, I figured, okay, this is like you've looked at this and you're not seeing how this could be saved. Is that correct?
We did. I first met with the staff from the Ugandan High Commission starting in 2014, I think, and had a tour, etc. And then there was, because as you say, Councillor, there is always, it's not a decision we take lightly. So this was a long process, a study of many of the engineering reports, discussions internally with senior management. So it, and over the course of that, we came with our recommendation. So. Madam Chair, the Councillor is correct. That is something that it's not a decision we ever make lightly, and it certainly isn't one we made lightly in this particular instance.
Thank you. The last question is, and this may have to go to Mr. Willis, but what I'm looking at, what we heard from a lot of people today is about, and from the ward councillor, he's been circulating information on the demolition by neglect piece. I'm trying to figure out how that weighs into this decision. What is the process for dealing with that? Or do we need a process to address that? Because I think we all agree that the work of our heritage people is important work if we are going to preserve our older buildings and items that we want to protect. So I believe we have to have some sort of a process to deal with that, not when it gets to this point when it's too late, but early on. Is there going to be some sort of an inspection of these heritage properties to prevent that? Okay, so go ahead then, Sal.
I'm going to Court Curry, because you remember a couple of years ago the mayor really bore down intensely on the demolition by neglect. Court, are you the best one to lead on this?
But this is an example. Like I know what you're talking about, what the mayor did, and I fully support what he did to try to get out there and stop this. But clearly, here's a building that has fallen into a bad state of disrepair. So I'm just wondering if we have to do something different, or if we are looking at something.
So, Councillor, certainly, as Chair Nussbaum advised, and you advised, the Mayor did strike the task force 2 years ago. We are now working very closely with our colleagues in Building Code Services and Bylaw Services. We've identified buildings that we have on a quote-unquote watch list, which we do regular inspections on, and we have been laying orders where we believe that their heritage attributes are not being respected, and we've been undertaking prosecutions.
So this building wasn't on that watch list then?
This building was on the watch list.
Oh, it was on
Yes.
the watch list. Okay. Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the explanation. Where am I going next? Councillor Cadre and then Councillor Fleury. Anybody else have questions? Okay, Councillor Cadre.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And just coming back to what Councillor Hibley was asking about, your preferences, obviously, as Heritage Department, is to protect as many buildings or as many properties that you can under the Heritage Act. In terms of the opinion that the staff's put in this report about a possible demolition of this property, or recommendation to demolish the property, what led you to that final decision? Was it the foundation itself, because it's a block foundation? Was it just the entire deterioration of the building, or was there other factors that played into your decision?
It was, Councillor, a combination of factors, and again, it wasn't an easy decision, but it was clearly, over the years, there have been significant efforts to repair the building by the owners, and after a tour and a review of the available information from engineering groups, and also, again, the building's existence as a minor with a lower score within the contributing building range, that at a certain point, balancing the report, the condition of the building and the reports from engineers on how that happened, and the value of the building as it contributes to the cultural heritage value of the Heritage Conservation District, in combination, led us to reluctantly agree that this would be an instance where we would not, that we could support the proposed demolition of the property, a property designated under the Ontario Heritage Act. And also, in terms of associations with Lester Pearson, what in the general principle, and this comes up, because everybody lives somewhere. So, what do we look at in terms of a person's contribution to a place? And our conclusion was that the property was not explicitly or meaningfully identified with the work of Lester Pearson when he lived there. He was doing magnificent work. We all know that at the time. But a lot of the work with the creation of a peacekeeping force was at the UN in East Block, where Foreign Affairs was located at the time. And so we balance all of that, and that's how we reached our conclusion, Councillor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thanks. And I think he spent 6 months in California working on the United Nations.
I haven't done a month-to-month analysis.
Well, I'm going to tell you that at our very own Carlton Lodge, about 6 years ago, Ann Jarrett passed away, who was his executive assistant back when he was working on the United Nations in California. And she was 106 and bright as, certainly probably brighter than I am today. She was sharp as a cookie, so I remember it well. It's funny to have the conversation now. Councillor Fleury, anybody else have questions? No? Okay.
So I just want to go back to the Built Heritage motion that was passed, and then the work that was conducted. Maybe more specific to Court or someone from the team. Did the city hire a consultant to look at retentions of portions of the building or the building itself? Because in the report, it alludes to things that could be saved, a cost to that, but there wasn't an explicit effort in my mind as part of the report for retention, or it wasn't clear. So I just want to understand, what did we ask as the city of the consultant?
So, Councillor, we did retain John Cook and Associates, and we did have them do a thorough assessment of the previous two engineering reports. As we mentioned, they came to the same conclusion, but they did provide a breakdown of the building and of the specific components in the building and the costs for salvaging or restoring those parts. The direction from committee was to look at incorporating parts of the existing building into the new design of a new building, or tweaking the design of the proposed building to become better in alignment with the Cultural Heritage Impact Study. We did first look at whether we could retain portions of the existing building into the new building. We've determined that the quality of the bricks is very poor. There is no architectural piece, a porch or a turret or an element that we could salvage and meld with the new building. So in this case, without it looking rather clumsy, so in this case we put our efforts on the second component of the motion, which was to bring the new building into alignment with the CHIS, and we've made some alterations to that design.
Can you speak to our city's effort? I'm concerned, and we're seeing a series of properties that are of heritage designation or in heritage districts that are vacant. And of those, there seems to be ongoing tactics by property owners to not heat the building or to leave the building vacant and not maintain them. So what are the efforts of the department in ensuring that the space is livable and that it retains its characteristics?
So, Councillor, certainly as we drive around the community and we rely on councillors and community associations and other groups to come forward and identify properties, as I mentioned earlier to Councillor Hubley, we have a team of my staff, bylaw services staff, and building code services staff that are going out and proactively completing investigations and laying orders under the Property Standards Act and prosecuting where required.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Leeper, did you have any questions? No? For wrap-up? Yeah, but I'm going to go back to the whole then. But we're starting wrap-up now. Councillor Brockington. And anyone else want to speak? Well, obviously, Councillor Fleury last. Anyone else? Okay, so just let me get organized here a bit, okay? So, Councillor Brockington. Councillor Leeper, did you want to? I'm going to put you down because you know you're going to want to. Yeah. Chair Nussbaum. You're not in. Councillor Cloutier, you're good? And no, Councillor Fleury is going to wrap up. That's why I'm putting Councillor Nussbaum in front of Councillor Fleury. Okay, so that's how we close up. Brockington, Leeper, Nussbaum, and Fleury.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, a procedural question. We have a motion before us coming from the subcommittee that's asking us to refuse the application. We could deal with that first, and Mr. Mark, I'm going to look to you just to get some comment. If the committee rejects the motion before us to refuse the application, would it then be immediately in order to move a motion to approve the application?
Madam Chair, it was my understanding that there would be a motion coming forward to substitute the staff recommendation for the Build Heritage Subcommittee recommendation. Motions are put as in a logical sequence as determined by the chair, but the standard rule is to put them in reverse order to which they are moved. So the amending motion that I understand is coming forward to approve the staff recommendation would typically be voted upon first, and if that lost, then the refusal would be voted upon.
Okay. Is that coming? Okay. So I just want to... Is the Vice Chair... Does he have a motion ready, just to make the committee aware?
We're going to give you copies.
Okay. So can I just, while that's circulated, I'll share my 2 cents. I don't believe this property was neglected, certainly not with the intent to allowing it to get to a state where we would then permit them to demolish their building. Certainly this building has suffered from a series of unfortunate events that have led to, I think, a very serious state of the building, and I do believe there is an argument to be made to approve the application to demolish it. There's no question that there is some historic events that have occurred within this building, and I do believe that if this building is demolished, there should be a commemoration or a plaque erected here to inform people who pass by that not only is this the site of a high commission, but that there was some significant or historic events that occurred here on the site, and provide sort of a detailed plaque. And I think I heard today from one of the representatives of the High Commission that they are prepared to do that. So I really appreciate that. Madam Chair, a quick scan on Wiki, and I'm not purporting that everything I read on Wiki is true, lists pages and pages of commemorations for one of Canada's greatest prime ministers, not just in Ottawa, but across Canada, including his birthplace, which no longer exists. According to Wiki, it says a plaque at the north end of the North American Life Building in North York, placed by the Willowdale Federal Liberal Party Association, commemorates the location where the manse in which Pearson was born previously stood. So that building at some point came down, a new building was erected, there's a plaque there to commemorate his birthplace. In addition to his Peace Prize, there's certainly a number of awards and medals in Pearson's honor, which certainly allow us to remember his significant contributions, including Canada's busiest airport and the Global Affairs or Foreign Affairs building here in Ottawa, which his name is associated with. So, I mean, I did not take this file lightly. I certainly read the information and listened to our speakers, and I thought the speakers today made a strong case why at least the historical events that occurred here should be recognized. I'm not convinced that that requires us to refuse the application to demolish the building. So, Madam Chair, I will be voting in favor today of approving the application. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Leeper?
Thanks, Chair. I was coming into this meeting today prepared to support the High Commission's efforts to have this building demolished, but I was listening to the presentation that was made by the residents of the community, and I think in this instance that geography matters. The physical building as a reminder of our past is important, and I think we sometimes forget the connection that physical things have to remind us of our past. I don't want to go too far down this path, but if you go to Memphis, Tennessee, to visit Graceland, right, Elvis Presley, there are actually two other buildings in Memphis. One where Elvis spent some formative years as a teenager. The other, the really crappy ranch home he bought before he bought Graceland. And people go there. He may only have lived in that house on the ranch home in the suburbs for a year, but people go there. Mike Pearson is obviously a significantly more substantial person with a significantly more important contribution to the world. And having that house, even though there's another one around the corner, matters. And then the collection of all those prime ministers' homes lead to a very special district. I'm not willing to vote in favor of that demolition today. I think the geography and the physical building matter too much. Once it's gone, it's gone. There's a temptation to take a look at this in a George Washington slept here context. You know, everybody has a sign out, George Washington slept here, but I think the substantial connection this building has with an important part of Canadian history is important to preserve. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Chair Nussbaum.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to provide a summary of my views. As I said at the outset, I supported the staff recommendation at Built Heritage, mostly due to the fact that in the February meeting we had set out a series of conditions, and although there was a strong preference for retention of some element of the building, the particulars of that motion were respected, and Mr. Curry is correct that the revised application did improve, if only in small ways, but did improve on the designs for the new construction. So I will continue to support the staff recommendation, mostly on the basis, as I said, that the original motion had been respected. That said, I think Councillor Hubley raised a very important point, and I should mention that I've been struggling since this application came forward to think about what the mechanism should be for the city to ensure that like in this case, a building owner of a heritage property that's owned it for 33 years is engaged in the type of much more affordable and efficient upkeep to obviate the need for demolition. And the only limitation to the Mayor's task force on heritage matters is I think all of the work up until this stage has been focused on vacant properties. And the issue is, and I think this is a great example, of an owner of a heritage property that is not vacant can still choose to not invest and lead that property into a state where decades later demolition seems to be the only reasonable option, which, you know, again, I understand that in this case, but the point is, why did it get there, and what steps does the city need to take to try and either incentivize building owners to invest in their heritage property? I think that's important, and I know that staff are looking at comparisons of various incentive programs across the country to make sure that there's not just a carrot approach, but or not just a stick approach, but a carrot. So I do think that that's something that needs to be considered, and I do recognize that you know, no one wants to be dealing with this file in the way we are. We wished we would have wished that the owner had made the investments to make this unnecessary. But I do want to pick up on that point, and I want to reassure members here that I am thinking deeply about that and hope to come forward in the coming months and through the work of the Mayor's task force on some concrete ideas to try and make sure that we're not dealing with cases like this in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Councillor Fleury.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. So I wanted to address a couple of elements, and as you know, I wish I would have had some time to review the AG report from the Ugandans, but in the limited time, I just want to re-clarify one of the sections of the report that Mr. Martin brought forward a few minutes ago, and that's on page 439. I shared it with committee earlier. It reads the following: the delay in renovations caused further deterioration, as earlier predicted by the consultants. After 2 years without renovations, the property has now been recommended for demolition. That, in my mind, highlights exactly the problem in this context, and it's really that there was identified deterioration of the property, that it be the foundation, that it be the systems, that it be the trees that were impacting the soil near the property, and nothing was done, so much so that the property was vacated and nothing was done. So we find ourselves years later where the applicant really had not done what was needed to protect the integrity of the property. Further to that, we've come to the table often at this committee relating to reports for that it be Infill 1, Infill 2, some of the heritage inventory report, and some of the extension to the heritage conservation districts in the area that will be coming in the next few weeks. This is in a heritage conservation district, and in my mind, the district is part of multiple buildings that have different heightened levels of interest, of value, but they all form the fabric of the district itself. Compounding that, there's the idea that we're a capital city, that in a residential community we have more than 40 missions, of which we have tremendous examples of strong collaborations with the community. In this context, it's really the built form that was abandoned. But, you know, I want committee to start thinking about, we might have, whatever the decision might be today, we might have other situations of other missions that receive this as a message. And I don't think that would be the type of message that we want to send. It's a mature neighborhood as heritage conservation districts. its proximity to Parliament Hill and the federal precinct is important. The connection into the neighborhood is also as valuable. And of that, as you know, there's a grassroots movement that you've heard recently with the application of All Saints Church and also with the efforts of Prime Minister's Row of protecting and highlighting how our prime ministers, the 10 of them that lived in Sandy Hill, lived and what sort of environment they were in and how they were connected right into the core of Sandy Hill. And this idea that decisions are only made on Parliament Hill and in the East or West Block or in New York City at the United Nations is false, and in my mind is more false than ever because of the gap in technology. Now, we know that coffees, meetings, and so on would have happened in that location. We know the importance of our country in terms of showcasing peace across the world. And obviously, I don't have to rhyme off all of the accomplishment of Mr. Pearson, but certainly Prime Minister Pearson, but certainly that, in my mind, is factored in. I will further disagree with Mr. Martin that the amount of money that was given to the mission here was simply for systems and trees. The amount of $1 million that would be $1 million American or $1 million Canadian sends the message that the country really wanted to see an investment in this property, and that investment was never done, and thus has led to today's application. So, committee, you're left with a series of options to consider, and I'll leave you with a few, which are: we had a staff report that I know we have a motion to bring back to the floor, but we have the work of our experts and residents on the Built Heritage Committee, and obviously it is this committee's purview to analyze that work and see its pertinence or its value. But in that context, a lot of elements were brought up by member Barry Podolsky and Sandy Smallwood that really highlighted that many of the properties in Sandy Hill have lived through the similar challenges of the soil conditions, and that a lot of the neglect and the issues of restoration and so on that you would see here could happen in any of the properties within Sandy Hill. So the committee really reviewed it, and not only PMR, not only demolition by neglect, but today you're informed, and I'm sorry it's last minute. I was only informed late in the afternoon and read the reports in the early morning. But the AG report, in my mind, is interesting, where there was a sum of money that was put in place for restoration. It never went to it, and today you're faced with the impacts of not restoring that property at its right time. So, I would ask for you to hold the position of Built Heritage Committee, to work with the Ugandan High Commission to find an approach that is suitable, and if the approach financially does not work in terms of protecting the property, then let's work with them on finding other solutions. The site could always be sold or purchased. I know that there's some interest in Sandy Hill, like you've seen with Betty Hyde, like you've seen with All Saints, to retain the property and highlight its value to our community and to our city. Merci.
Thank you, Councillor Fleury. Okay, so we're going to go to the Vice Chair Tierney, who has a motion. He wants to put on the floor. You all have a copy of it.
Yeah, it should be in front of you right now. Again, Madam Chair, we've asked Councillor Leeper asked the motion to be split. So there's two sections. That the Planning Committee 1 received the revised Cultural Heritage Impact Statement, document 15, dated November 22nd, 2017, prepared by Robert Martin Architects. And number 2, approve the original report recommendations as submitted by staff on April 5th, 2018. 2, approve the application for demolition of the application for the new construction of 231 Colebrook Street.
Yes, and so on part 1, is that received? It's received. And part 2, to approve the original report recommendations as submitted by staff on April the 5th, to approve the application for demolition and the application for new construction at 231 Colebrook Street. Yeas and nays have been called. Councillor Blais? Councillor Brockington?
Yes.
Councillor Shirelli?
Yes.
Councillor Cloutier? Councillor Hublet? Councillor Leeper? No. Vice Chair of Heritage Nussbaum? Chair of Heritage Nussbaum?
Yes.
Councillor Kadri?
Yes.
And Vice Chair Tierney?
Yes.
Myself, yes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That's 9-1. And on item number 8, the Planning Committee recommend Council approve an amendment to zoning bylaw 2008-2050 for 231 Coburg to permit an office limited to an embassy.
Chair, just a quick comment on that one?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, it's just important because it's an important point of clarification because Chad Rollins made an observation about the zoning, and I think it is important to state that many residential zonings permit what is called in the zoning bylaw a diplomatic mission, which is probably a word that ought to be changed because to the normal ear that suggests an office, but it's not. It's essentially an official residence. So it is, in this case, a zoning amendment is required, but I can understand why people reading the existing zoning and seeing the words diplomatic mission might assume that would allow for the type of embassy or consulate use which is being proposed here. I just wanted to clarify that.
That's a great point, and I will just add to that before the meeting I was speaking with our General Manager, Steve Willis, and as you know, in the next term of council, the official plan, all the big plans are coming forward, but the official plan being one of them. And we had a discussion about, we're going to have to give some real attention to heritage. Mr. Willis, did you want to just speak to that, and then we'll vote on the item?
Madam Chair, I think staff are going to be bringing forward a report later on in this term on potential incentives to the councillor's point. I think it's a good opportunity then to talk about other matters that we may bring forward for consideration when we do the official plan review. So my suggestion, Madam Chair, is we take that together at that time.
Yep. Great. Okay, so on the zoning bylaw amendment, is that carried? Right. So we do have we have one item that Vice Chair Tierney is going to move it to council tomorrow, and that is
Great, and I got it in front of me, Madam Chair. Whereas the approximate 18 months that's been required for the studies and the process leading to the official plan amendment, whereas advancing this item will assist in the efficient development of the land, be it resolved that Planning Committee approve that this matter proceed to Council on April 25th, 2018.
And just the other, number 2, the Boris O'Kane, and just to embellish that a little bit, Mr. Herwire, who was very involved in that file, it took a lot of time to get us to this point, and because no one came out today, and we'll just get going on it. All right, so it's carried, great, and just one other thing for all of you. The next meeting on May the 8th, it's starting at 10 a.m., not 9:30. No, it's all good.